we're not going to go back to 1948. So, there has to be land redistribution, financial compensations, all kinds of things. But you're not going to go back to your particular house if you're a refugee. It's not there. Israel's demolished systematically about 600 entire Palestinian villages, towns, and urban areas. Now, there's one interesting thing here, though, that people don't know. There's a Palestinian geographer named Salman Abu Sita, who's done a lot of research on this, and he's found that 85% of the land taken from the Palestinians in 1948 is still available. 85%. It was never built upon. It's either agricultural land or it's under national parks. So the idea is, that Palestinian refugees could actually go back to the parts of the country where they're from. Now, there's an organization called Zochrot, some of you might know, that's dedicated to returning to the refugees, preparing for the return of the refugees. And they have a wonderful program of young Palestinian architects and planners who are actually planning new communities in these parts of the country for the refugees when they come back. So the idea is you have a place to come back to. It's from where you came from, so it's meaningful. But nevertheless, it's a modern community, and you get reintegrated into the society. So, we're not going to go back exactly to 1947, 48, but substantially we could really address the needs of the refugees, I think. Look, the organization isn't easy. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, in the West Bank, they live under two occupations, the Palestinian Authority and Israel. So you can't get organizations to sign up. Organizations can be closed down by the Palestinian Authority. And organizations, to tell you the truth, if they sign on to the one state, Palestinian organizations, they'll lose their funding. The EU, the UN, church groups, they won't fund a one-state approach. So that what we're trying to do, then our strategy is to get individuals to endorse. If we can get hundreds of people to endorse it, in Palestine, again, in the camps, in the exile, in the diaspora, plus Israeli Jews, we can show that we're a meaningful voice. And we can grow that. And that would give us a legitimacy to come to you and to come to people abroad and begin to build. The campaign is largely built. I mean, that's the good news. I mean, you've all done wonderful work. JVP, I mean, all of you have done, Students for Justice in Palestine, all these different groups have done wonderful work. So we have something to build on. So I don't think it's pie in the sky. I think we have, it's that easy to organize. And I'll be honest with you too, there is a problem in the Palestinian community that we're confronting, and that is that a lot of all the Palestinians know the two-state solution is gone, but a lot of them really don't believe the one state is possible. That's true. If you're a Palestinian, I mean, I travel the world, so I go to Tromsø and I come to New York, and I can see the support. I can see how we can build a movement. If you're a Palestinian stuck in the West Bank or Gaza, and you have the Israeli army on your head, the Palestinian Authority and militia on your head all the time, you're isolated, your homes are being demolished, you're impoverished, you worry about your kids, I can understand why people simply say, I'm just going to either get out or hunker down and just live my life. I don't believe that it's possible to defeat Israel, especially with American support. So part of our struggle in the beginning is to convince Palestinians, not about the one state, but to convince them that actually it's doable. That if we have a strategy and we organize, that this is a doable thing. And I can understand that they're exhausted and fragmented and oppressed in many ways, but this has to be a Palestinian-led movement, and so, we're working on that. Not yet. Not yet, because, again, we haven't launched yet. So we're in the process. We're talking with Omar. The question was about Omar Barghouti, who, was one of the heads of the BDS National Committee in Ramallah. And I think I don't want to speak for Omar, but he's stuck. He supports the one-state solution. He's written about that. I'm not sure he supports the idea of collective rights. That's a disagreement that we have with other groups. Some feel that the collective rights legitimizes Zionism, and therefore they just want one person, one vote. I mean, that's a whole discussion we're having. Omar's other concern, of course, is the reason the BDS movement hasn't adopted a particular solution or program is because they're afraid of splitting the BDS movement. And it's true, if they came out for one state, I think they would lose a lot of people that support BDS. In the end, in my view, BDS isn't a standalone proposition. I mean, it has to be connected to an end game. So again, it might be a process. If we can show that we represent a major voice, some Palestinians who are reluctant today will hopefully join in. Also, the U.S. campaign, JVP, other groups also don't, and they shouldn't until today, advocate for a particular solution because that's not their role. They're not the stakeholders. But once Palestinians, and there again I say, if we can show that we're a meaningful voice, once there's an alternative Palestinian voice that says this is a program we want you to endorse and support, then I think we'll begin to negotiate with the different groups, Palestine Solidarity Committees, JVP, U.S. campaign, and so on, to support our program. In other words, the day that you can be a Palestinian support group and not support any political program should be over if, in fact, we can bring forward a political program that has meaningful support. So that's all going to be a process. Yeah, I mean, the question has to do with another reason why Israel would get so much support and why it'd be hard to defeat it is because of the economic issues that we talked about, which is certainly true.
And not by here, like companies here would never support it.
That's right. But that's one reason why I'm talking about a global Palestine, because the economics of Palestine and Israel aren't confined to Palestine, and the the political struggle against what's happening in Palestine isn't confined to Palestine either. This all spills out into the global arena. So in a sense, I think, the problem is when I come to speak, like tonight, I don't know you, a lot of you, but I would assume there's millions of activists in New York City. The people that come to hear me speak are the sliver that are interested in Israel-Palestine. And all the other issues we're all siloed in our issues. So I think this idea of focusing on the money and on the power and the technologies of repression and using Israel as a window into the wider global picture could expand the circles of people involved in this. You don't have to be an Israel-Palestine wonk to be concerned with the implications of what's happening globally in terms of Israel exporting the occupation. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but it seems that most Palestinians would love a neoliberal state. I mean, the idea of a revolutionary socialist liberation regime is kind of gone by the boards. And it certainly started with Fayyad when he was the prime minister who brought in, from the World Bank, who brought in credit cards. Today, you didn't have credit cards. Today, all Palestinians have credit cards, so they're more concerned. That's another issue. They're so concerned with paying off their credit card payments that they don't have the space for political stuff. I think that was a part of a domestication strategy, actually, that was introduced. So we've got that, you've got that problem. But otherwise, there's an Israeli political economist, some of you might know, named Shir Hever, who writes a lot about the political economy of the occupation. And he claims that actually there's a lot of complementarity between the Palestinian economy, repressed as it is, and the Israeli economy in all kinds of ways. You know, Palestinians have a very vibrant high-tech industry and telecommunications industry. It can't really function, but it's there, and a lot of the people in the Microsoft community in Washington State are Palestinians. They're the second largest community after the Indians in Redmond, Washington. So you've got that. If you take all the Palestinians in the world and all the Israelis in the world, there are more Palestinian students in universities than there are Israelis. You know, they have that potential of economically, educationally, and also we have to also put into the equation the Palestinian diaspora. They have a very rich diaspora, a very wealthy diaspora, a very educated diaspora, that would no less so than the Jews do, that kicked in for Israel. So they have the Palestinians have resources, and I think, given a level playing field, that actually they could achieve economic parity with Israelis within a fairly short period of time. They're not a people that, you know, that's starting from scratch by any means. Well, it's a question whether there's going to be a plan at all, because it seems like a non-starter before they begin. You know, we're having elections in April, and then it's going to take a couple months to put the government together. By the summer, the end of the summer, you guys go into a new election cycle. So there's really not much of a window for a program. I don't think the Trump administration would want a lot of Israeli pushback, and there'd be a lot of pushback, even though it's a very pro-Israel solution they're thinking of in an election year. I mean, Trump really tried to emphasize yesterday in the State of the Union how good he is to the Jews. You know, so I don't know. But basically the plan is something like this. In other words, Jerusalem is already Israeli, so that's gone. Israel would annex most of the West Bank, where the settlements are. The 62% of the West Bank, that's called Area C, would be annexed to Israel, which would then give Israel about 85% of the country, including, of course, all the borders, the water, Jerusalem, and the Palestinians would get basically areas A and B. Now, they might remove a few little settlements in between. A couple were removed in the Gaza disengagement in 2005 or 6. You know, just a little bit to you know, make it look a little better on the map. But basically, we're talking about a Bantustan of 3 cantons, 3.5 with Jericho sticking out here, that would be Palestinian. And the idea is that they would be affiliated with Jordan. They would get Jordanian identity, and maybe even, you know, through Jericho, a kind of a extra, you know, corridor between these areas, these 3 cantons and Jordan. And that's sort of the idea. It's really a part. Now, Jordan isn't playing along with this. Jordan is resisting. But Jordan's in a very vulnerable situation itself. So, but this is obviously a non-starter. And it's a non-starter for Israel, too, in some ways, because it's too much of a Palestinian presence in the heart of Judea and Samaria. And then part of the idea is also, I believe, to make Gaza an independent country. And I think Hamas would actually agree with that. So the idea is it would be independent. Egypt might give a piece of the Sinai to thicken it. Israel might give a few kilometers around to make it a little thicker. And Israel has a whole plan they've talked about, of building islands into the sea So Israel would build a seaport for Gaza into the sea. It would build an airport in the sea. And it would even build industrial and residential areas on these artificial islands in the sea. So from that point of view, they believe Gaza could be made a viable entity. And now, really, Israel, in a sense, is home free. The Palestinians are Jordanians. We don't have to give them citizenship. We control 85% of the country. The settlements remain. Jerusalem is ours. And everybody gets rid of Gaza. We don't want Gaza, and Egypt doesn't want Gaza. So I think, broadly, I think this is the Trump idea. It's off the table in that it's pretty much been recognized, not just recognized by the Trump administration. It's true. It's true. They say it still has to be negotiated, but basically they allow Israel. I mean, Israel annexed it formally 50 years ago, and they build. There are more Israelis in East Jerusalem today than there are Palestinians. So there's no physically, in terms of the facts on the ground, there's no way it could ever be detached. But I mean, there you go back to the idea of what force. You know, the problem is, you know, international law supports the Palestinians, and Israel's in violation of every article of the 14th Geneva Convention. But, you know, it's like Stalin's old saying, you know, how many divisions does the UN have? Who's going to come? It's unenforceable, because any UN decision to enforce international law, and the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which in principle is the highest court in the world, don't tell Roberts that, has ruled that this is an occupation. It is an occupation. It violates international law. There are conventions. But in order for it to be enforced, the Security Council has to send a force to enforce it. Well, the United States would veto anything like that. It's never even come up because it wouldn't pass the security. So it's unenforceable. So let me just say this. Logistically, I agree a little bit. Logistically, it's possible, I suppose. You could say there's only 800,000 Israelis. I mean, millions of people have been moved around Europe after World War II. It's not impossible. You'd have to build, it's estimated it would cost $40 or $50 billion to move the settlers out, give alternative housing and so on, move, let's say, refugees in. It's doable logistically. But what's missing, besides an Israeli willingness, is any willingness on the part of the international community to do this. So if, and I actually have thought about this in a BDS campaign, if there was a campaign, in particular in the United States, that said a campaign that the American government would not veto a Security Council resolution that calls for the removal of Israel from the occupied territory, that would really be a whole revolution. So that's something we've never tried. We've never focused on that. And we've always let the United States veto, or the United States abstain sometimes because other countries veto. That would be interesting. You know, so I agree. Anything we can try to move things forward, we should try. Why does Israel want a conflict with Iran? Again, it's a part of what I call Israeli security politics that has to do with all of this. So that, you know, we often talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. I would say, and I know I'm being provocative, but I would really, I think I could say this, that, you know, in the Sunni-Shiite civil war between the Sunni countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and so on, and Shiite is Iran, with Iraq kind of in the middle and so on, Israel has taken very publicly the side of the Sunnis, to a degree that I would argue that Israel has become the hegemon, the leader of the Sunni Arab world. You know, that Saudi Arabia can't fight the Houthis in Yemen without Israeli support, let alone Iran. That Israel really has, and in a way, if you think about it, that was the subtext of what was called the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002 that still is on the table that we forget about. And there, Saudi Arabia led that initiative that said to Israel, if you know, what they basically said is, look, we want you to be the hegemon. We want you to be the leader. You know, you've got the weaponry. You'll help us repress our own populations. You know, there's the Khashoggi family of the journalist that was killed in Istanbul is suing the Israeli government and an Israeli security firm because they sold the Saudi government the eavesdropping technologies that caught him in Istanbul. So Israel's very involved in the internal repression in these countries. Sisi has talked about how Israel is supporting his regime just a couple weeks ago very publicly. So Israel has taken the Sunni side, and that allows Israel to parlay that into a regional hegemony. In other words, Israel becomes powerful not only because of its own exports, but in a sense because without Israel you can't deal with the wider issues in the Middle East. And to the degree that the United States is against Iran for all kinds of issues, oil, and China's involved with that, and all kinds of, I think it's irrational, but it is. That, of course, boosts the Israeli role in the United States. So there's a lot of issues, again, global issues, besides Israel-Palestine, that's involved in Israeli security politics. Just basically, in terms of the framing, you could say that, I mean, I don't really mean it this way, but in terms of this kind of discussion with the Jewish community, you could say this: Israel could have been a Jewish state, in a way. I mean, it's not completely true because 30% of Israeli citizens are not Jewish. But leaving that aside, the two-state solution, in a way, could have left Israel as Israel. And then we fight out inside, but it could have left it as Israel. And in some ways, settler colonialism won. I mean, Israel settler colonialism won because the indigenous people said to Israel, we will normalize with you. We will nativize you. We will, and the indigenous are the only ones who can do this. We will give you the, imprimatur of being legitimate if you allow us to set up a state on the 22% of our country. In other words, we give up political claim to 78% of our country, which is unprecedented. That indigenous people would do that in terms of the colonial masters, but they did that. In 1988. In 1988, the PLO accepted the two-state solution and recognized Israel within these borders. So you could say at that time Zionism won. It won. And it could have been normalized. In other words, 30 years ago, we could have had a Jewish state on 78% of the country, recognized by everyone. We could have been 30 years into peace and security, and imagine how that might have impacted on the Middle East of today. And it was an Israeli decision to say no, supported by the Jewish community. So in a sense, if Israel cannot be a Jewish state, and it's clear it cannot be a Jewish state. I mean, this is gone, and it can't be an apartheid Jewish state, and it can't be, in the one-state idea, it's not Jewish. So Israel cannot be a Jewish state because of Israeli decisions. Well, but there you have to call the Jews. The fact that it claims to be one means apartheid. So you have to say to the Jewish community, which is still among the most liberal in the United States, I mean, do you really want to support an apartheid regime? And I think this is one reason, if I understand, that the young generation of Jews, and I think JVP is certainly working with that population, is starting to wean itself away from Israel. Because it's very hard to identify with an apartheid state if American Jewry, for the most part, defines itself by human rights and social justice. So that dissonance, so in a way it's not such a hard argument. If you can prove, the problem is that the Jewish community, you know, firewalls itself. It doesn't allow me to speak. It doesn't allow critical Jews. I don't know if JVP can speak in Hillel houses. You know, in other words, it firewalls so that this doesn't get through. And then, of course, you do birthright trips and all this sort of stuff. So I think this is getting through. And if we frame it in a way to say to Jews, you know, you can, and not only are you supporting an apartheid regime, but it represents you. That's the thing that the Jewish community has to accept. When Netanyahu goes in front of the UN and says, I attack Gaza, he says that in the name of the Jewish people, not in the name of Israel. So if Jews here, the Jewish establishment, doesn't say no, you do not represent us. We didn't vote for you. You can't represent us. If they don't say that, then they're complicit. They're agreeing. And that's where, in a sense, the Jewish community, I think, is doing a tremendous injustice to the Jewish community itself, the organized Jewish community, because it's making Jews complicit. And if Jews are complicit in apartheid, you can't turn around and say that's anti-Semitism, because in fact, you know, it's Jewish racism. So these are issues that should be a part of an intra-Jewish discussion that is not being had because the organized Jewish community won't allow it. What the ANC did was, in 1955, in its Freedom Charter, it said, our vision of South Africa after apartheid is inclusive. Now, it didn't persuade most of the whites to support the ANC, but when the day of transition came, when de Klerk came and said it's over, it allowed the transition to happen because the whites knew that they were a part of the new society. In other words, there was even a new constitution. And I think that's what we're doing here. You know, it's the Palestinians in our program that are saying our vision of this country, one democratic state, is inclusive. And that's what the collective rights part says to Israeli Jews. You know, we're not against you. We're not going to drive you out. This isn't against anything. We want to transform our society from apartheid into something just and inclusive, but it's inclusive of you as well. And I think that that message, I don't think it's going to convince the Israeli Jews, maybe Jews abroad, but that is the message. So that when we get to a point where we are effective and we are beginning to affect governments, you know, this is what softens that opposition. I've spoken, I'll tell you the truth, I've spoken to groups, even Palestinian groups, and I say one state, and the first thing you say is, what about the Jews? I mean, boom, that's the first thing. So you have to, but once you address it the way we did, that they'll be safe as a community, but with no privileges, no special rights, just simply a safety net. That allows people to relax. And now wholeheartedly, we can support the Palestinian struggle because it's not against anybody. It's not excluding anybody. It's inclusive. And you know, the Israelis are going to have to argue for continuing, you know, their existence in an exclusionary kind of a way. So I think if we do this right, it's a no-brainer discussion. Inclusion and equality versus apartheid and exclusion. I'll tell you something interesting. The Palestinians that support us today, or it's actually led by them, is, again, I mentioned the Balad Party, Tajamo, the Palestinian National Party, and the Islamic Party. The Islamic Party doesn't have really, they have a problem with, and this is something, I didn't get into this, we're avoiding the word secular. You know, because it's a red flag, but we obviously want a secular society. So the way we're phrasing it, yeah, because we're trying to find wording that you know, says what we want it to say, but doesn't alienate. So we're saying the The authority to govern, emanates from the consent of the governed. That's a secular state. It's not a religious law, and it's not, but we don't use the word secular because the Islamic movement wouldn't support it if it was. So there's a kind of that language issue as well. The ones that are the most opposed are the Communist Party in Israel. They're so dedicated to the two-state solution, they won't even listen. So I sometimes joke that I'm glad my mother didn't live to see the day I was to the left of the Communist Party. The Communist Party and Fatah, the major Palestinian party, are both committed to two states. So there's a lot of work for Palestinians to do within their own community, besides all this work abroad.
Well, really, I'm saying, if this would destroy the Jewish national security state, would it destroy the economy of Israel?
Yeah, I mean, that's real, and that gets back to what we were talking about before about an economic struggle that we haven't talked about tonight. Against neoliberalism, against capitalism. That's part of this, and with that, I think we have to fight the Palestinians, the Palestinian establishment, as much as the Israeli. But I think the idea is that, if you resolve this issue, IsraelPalestine could retool easily into a very sophisticated, high-tech, they're doing it already, in a high-tech industries that aren't military. The problem is that almost all technologies today are military. The military is the incubator for all of this. DARPA, many of you know DARPA. It's the Department of the Pentagon that has a budget of $4 or $5 billion, a small budget. If you look on the website, their mission is to make science fiction real. So the money, all that money, the billions you need for research and development, governments do. And they do it through their militaries. So the militaries become the incubators of all the byproducts. So what I write about in my book a lot is, nanotechnology is seen as very benign because it's connected to biomedicine. A nano is a molecular size thing. You can put it in, if you have circulation problems, you can put a nano monitor in your bloodstream, and it's so small it won't stop the flow of blood. So it's great. But Israel is the world's leader in the military applications of nanotechnology. What happens if you have a nano weapon that you can load up with artificial intelligence, load up with poisons, or diseases, or all kinds of, you can weaponize a molecule. And a nanobot, kind of a molecular size robot, can self-replicate 1 trillion times within about 48 hours. So these are types of weapons that are tremendous in their power. And in a way, they're seen as having civilian applications that are benign, but really they're coming out of the military world. And so that's I think, one message in my book, is that none of the technology we have is not related is unrelated to or all the technology we have is related to the military. And we have to understand that because let me just say this, I wrote a book about something I know nothing about. Why? Because most of us on the left, not all of us, but most of us on the left come from the social sciences or the humanities or the arts. We don't know what these 25-year-old kids in the laboratories in Carnegie Mellon next door, with budgets of billions of dollars, are cooking up. We don't know those technologies. I didn't know them, certainly. And so the middle of my book, I have to warn you, is boring. Because I get into these technologies. We have to start to learn this. So again, Palestine can be that window that opens us up to much wider issues that we have to know about. Thank you very much.